Hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom Over Fascism Live. Today, I have with me Heather Cronk, and she is the founder of Project 2112, which aims to provide a clear on-ramp for community building and solidarity organizing to former evangelicals, which we'll refer to as ex-evangelicals or post-evangelicals, in order to help folks make meaning of their experiences, be emboldened in community with others, and take action to diminish the power of rising Christian nationalism, fueled in large part by evangelical leaders. I would love to hear from you about your background and why it is that evangelical Christianity is so linked with white nationalism and what's going on in our country today. So Heather, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you founded Project 2112, and also, why is it important?
Yeah. Yes. Happy to do all of those things. Good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to come on, and very glad to have folks joining us live. Very eager for the conversation today. By way of background, I spent about 10 years in my growing up years as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. My parents are not evangelical. They're Christian. They go to church on Sundays. But I found evangelicalism and the very fundamentalist variety all on my own. So from the ages of about 13 to 23, I was about as sanctimonious of a Christian as you could find. And that's a high bar. There are a whole lot of really sanctimonious Christians. But I was on up there. So I did the whole 9 yards. I was running discipleship groups. I was leading worship at our youth group and in college groups. I was filling my days judging other people with my very sanctimonious heart. And it wasn't until I went to I grew up in Kentucky and other parts of the South, and went to college at a conservative school kind of in the mountains of Georgia. And it wasn't until I went to seminary after college that the kind of fundamentalist hold on my theology started to break. And that's pretty common with folks who leave evangelicalism, is when you start to leave your home community and start to interact with people who are different than you. That's where a lot of kind of fundamentalist thought starts to break down. And so that happened for me about halfway through my seminary experience. I had started deconstructing my theology. And that was really, that was the result of being in community with folks who had different theologies than I did, who were queer, who were second career. That was the first time that I was around folks who were not white for the first time in kind of a meaningful way. So my theology started to break down. I left evangelicalism, left my fundamentalist theology, figured out I was queer a few months after that. Whole world made a whole lot more sense once I kind of got to an agnostic place theologically and figured out I was queer. And kind of stumbled into the nonprofit sector after that, which I didn't know was a thing growing up. Didn't know that was a career that you could pursue. But that's where I found organizing. That's where I found the progressive movement. For a former evangelical, organizing made a ton of sense. I was like, yes, I can tell my story. I can talk with people about the stakes of campaigns. I can recruit people into organizing campaigns. And so I've kind of been there for about the past almost 25 years, been in progressive organizing. Project 2112 started to kind of take root in my brain a little bit a few years ago. I started to kind of revisit my process of deconstruction. And when I started doing that, I was doing it with new eyes, with kind of organizer eyes, and started to find a whole lot more people who had been through that process. I went through that process I'm not so old that the internet didn't exist, but I am old enough that I am old enough that, it wasn't, finding other people online who had a common experience was just kind of starting to take off. Um, so, more recently found that, folks had named that experience that, started talking about their experience as an ex-evangelical that helped people find each other, helped people see each other and be seen, which is so deeply important to us as humans. Um, but when I started looking around, I found there was a lot of personal storytelling, which makes sense. We were former evangelicals. We'd, tell a lot of
Mhm.
stories. Um, but there wasn't any effort to organize those folks. And so as I started to look into the data and talk to more people, I found that there was a real hunger from folks to actually be connected. And B, there are 15 million people who just in the US who grew up evangelical and have left. Half are still Christian, half are not religious, but it's a lot of people who have left
Wow.
the evangelical church.
15 million. Wow. So, when you started to organize them, and I guess as you continued, what did you find in terms of um, their view on the world and how it connected with, we could say politics, we could say current events, we can, however we want to phrase that. Um, I'm really interested in that connection and um, earlier today, Nick Perro and Walter Ryan, friends in this community, had a live going where people were talking about white Christian nationalists as being fake Christian. And uh, and Nick and I and others really pushed back against that because Christianity really does have, uh, you know, we don't get to say that someone's not a Christian. I don't get to say someone's not a Jew, even though they're like horrible people out there. So can you talk a little bit? That's four questions in one. I do that and I apologize. So first, what's the relationship of a bunch of the general ex-evangelical community and current events? And just to, as a quick aside, I have talked to so many people who are deconstructing their Christianity or have done so as part of other conversations on
Yep.
here, where it
Yep.
just comes up that that's how they were raised. And I find that really, really fascinating because you're the first person that I specifically am talking to about this, but it has come up with a lot, maybe not the only person. And there's Andrew Watkins who helps um, translate the language into non-evangelical speech. But so, yeah, if you can talk about that relationship with current events, that would be great.
Yeah. Yeah. As I have, so I've kind of been working on this project for not even a year, about 10 months, uh, in a kind of in a concerted way. And so much of, um, kind of hearing folks' stories and trying to sort of see patterns in that and try to understand what the opportunities are for connection and for organizing. There are kind of a few different generations of ex-evangelicals, right? So I grew up in the 90s kind of purity culture ex-evangelicals. That's sort of a generation. There's kind of a generation before that. There are a couple of generations after that. There's sort of peaks where um, folks, either start to see holes in evangelicalism or there are world events that kind of help radicalize folks out of evangelicalism. And so it kind of depends on what generation you're in
Hmm.
as to what the reasoning was. For folks who are part of 90s purity culture evangelicalism, a lot of the kind of way out was either starting to realize that you had a queer identity, or meeting, and this is like one of the top reasons why people leave evangelicalism, meeting a queer person who wasn't terrible, right? Like we're taught that queer folks are terrible, and then you have a life experience where you accidentally meet a kind queer person, you're like, wait a second, what else am I being taught that doesn't actually ring true for me?
Mm-hmm.
There was a peak, in 2015 and 2016 during Trump's first run. There was a peak in 2020 around the racial reckoning that was happening across the country and during the pandemic. And so there are a lot of reasons, there are kind of a lot of peaks when people leave. But, there's sort of two sides of evangelicalism. There is one side that is, I think the logical conclusion of a lot of evangelical thought is authoritarianism.
Okay. Let's talk more about that.
Yeah, when you like really, the fundamentalism that I adhered to for a long time is very rigid, very black and white, control oriented, order oriented, gender hierarchies, inerrancy of scripture. Your pastor is the authority. Like it creates strongmen, right? So it makes sense to me that like the logical conclusion is for evangelicalism to lead toward authoritarianism. That hasn't always been the case, though. There is a kind of second story. There's a friend referred to it earlier today in a conversation as a minority report. And actually, evangelical Christians were at the forefront of the abolition movement, have been at the forefront of labor movement, have been at the forefront of the sanctuary movement of the 80s and early 90s. There is another story to be told. So I think that, part of what we're doing is trying to intervene in the ways that evangelical leaders are marching their congregations toward authoritarianism and saying actually that whether you find another path within Christianity, just not evangelicalism, or whether you find a path through secularism, there are other ways that we can operate. There's a different vision for the future that we can embrace.
So one of the things that is going on now, so which everybody in the chat, and I'm not saying anything that's at all revolutionary, is that a lot of the MAGA base are white Christian nationalists, or white Christian nationalists have a propensity for being okay with authoritarianism. So you talked a little bit about why that may be, but how do you see that particular link being playing out right now, especially as the violence is increasing, as folks are being radicalized in white Christian nationalism outside of, I don't really think about the left as being radicalized. I think of us mostly as being, consistent. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. The data shows that the more two things connected to Christian nationalist identity. You are more likely to be a Christian nationalist adherent if you identify as a white evangelical. And you are more likely to be a Christian nationalist adherent if you identify as a white evangelical and regularly attend religious services. So the more evangelical religious you are, the more likely you are to adhere to a Christian nationalist ideology. That doesn't mean that only evangelicals have Christian nationalist sympathies, but it's most kind of salient in that way. I think that, for me, that's one of the reasons why it feels so important and so strategic to be organizing ex-evangelicals, because we actually understand the worldview that folks are coming out of and what it is within evangelicalism and even within Christian nationalism that's feeding folks, that's keeping them inside that system. We also have like a little bit of a decoder ring that helps us understand or empathize with folks on what might pull them out. So, the like main thrust of Project 2112 isn't to persuade people out of evangelicalism, but there is some of that. Like, we do hope to do some of that. And part of that is by creating an alternative. If we don't have an alternative that can feed people in the same way that they're being fed right now in evangelical churches, if we don't have community and welcome and belonging and all the things that actually evangelical churches are very good at, that the left is very bad at, if we can't offer that, then we're fighting with one hand behind our backs. So part of it is figuring out what's keeping people in. And then part of it is figuring out how do we create a more compelling alternative that might lure people out, especially when folks are seeing increased violence, that violence is getting closer and nearer to them. I think that this might be another one of those peaks where folks are looking to get out.
So what do you think will be the effect of the murder of Renee Good? She was Christian, clearly not right-wing evangelical, queer, a mother, but she wasn't a person of color. And I know that, the regime regrets a lot that the first murder, that they killed a white woman instead of killing a black or brown person, because it galvanizes people, sadly, more. Do you think that this particular event of last week will galvanize more people to leave or to have some sort of awakening or some sort of deconstruction? Or do you think that identities are mostly set right now?
Well, I mean, look, I'm an organizer. I can't believe that identities are mostly set right now, or there's no point. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that what happened for me was that I was no longer able to hold the amount of cognitive dissonance that was surrounding me, and that was breaking through what I had been taught. I think that breakthrough cognitive dissonance is really hard in the media landscape that we live in, right? It's actually very hard to break through. It's not difficult to break through to someone's heart. It is hard to break through someone's media diet, their media ecosystem. And so as long as the regime is dominating the story and dominating media and telling one version of the story, and other versions of the story aren't breaking through, I think that's going to be really hard. I think that's also why it's really important. I see a lot of folks on the left, and I used to be one of these folks as well, who, as soon as they see someone in their life who is on the right or MAGA or voted for Trump or whatever, start to kind of waver a little bit, there's a shame cycle that starts. Well, what took you so long? Why did it take the death of a white woman? And it's actually just not effective. It actually like causes people to go back into their protective place. And the important thing for folks on the left to understand is it reinforces everything they're hearing on the news and from the pulpit and from their family. So the more that we can remain open and say, do we wish you had come in yesterday? Yeah, we do. Do we wish you had come in a year ago? We do. But we're glad that you're here now. Let's actually use this as an opportunity to kind of have some of those breakthrough conversations.
That's really interesting. Do you find that, given the media landscape, where we have the corporate media and the right-wing media and the regime media is sort of all glomming together, and there's no basic reality that we all agree on, do you find that organizing and essentially talking to people more in person is more, and with whatever your network is for people reaching out to people in their lives, is the most effective way to reach folks? Or is there another way to open the doors and be welcoming to those who are sort of new to more open thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I first started kind of exploring whether this project was a thing or whether there was a there, um, I started by surveying ex-evangelicals across the country and got responses from about 60 or 70 people. And one of the questions that I asked was two questions. I asked folks how long ago they deconstructed, and I asked them how many evangelicals are you still connected to in your life, in your like real life, not just like someone who I went to high school with who I haven't talked to in 30 years. Um, and I was so surprised by how many evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, are still connected to. That's not unique to ex-evangelicals, but I actually thought that it would be a much smaller number. And so I do think that there's something, for those, there are plenty of good self-preservation reasons to sort of either cut off family or to cut off communication or to put some boundaries up around how you'll interact with folks who may be harmful to you. But I think that the more that folks can continue to open those lines of communication to the extent that it's not harmful, I do think that the relationship matters. It does grease the wheels. I brought my mom along. Again, my parents aren't fundamentalist, but they're conservative and always have been. I brought my mom along on immigration when I was part of, gosh, this was probably 15 years ago. I was part of an immigration action where we got arrested around the DREAM Act. And I did not mean for my mom to find out about this, but my sister told my mom about this. And so, I ended up having a conversation with my mom, and she was like, well, why on earth? This seems so radical. Why on earth would you take that kind of action? I said, well, mom, my mom was a preschool teacher in rural Kentucky for a while. I said, well, mom, you have students who, come to your class every day and they're there very regularly and then they disappear and they're no longer there. Why do you think that is? And so like we kind of went back and forth around a topic that was highly charged, especially at that time. It is now still. She had never had a conversation. She had never been kind of asked what she thinks about it. And I made it really personal. Like, these are kids who I know that you really care about.
Mm-hmm.
And I know probably at some point you really wonder what happens to them, but you probably don't let yourself think about it very much because it's almost too much to bear. But once you sort of ask that kind of open question, I wasn't trying to shame her. I wasn't trying to radicalize her. I just said, aren't you curious what happens to those kids? And she's come around. I mean, she's not an immigration activist by any means, but she and my dad both changed their party registration in 2016 and vote Democrat and are very happy to do so. And I think that relationship piece just is so important, to be curious with someone you're still in a relationship with.
I hear that curious term, and I think about a lot of ways of interacting where curiosity is the driver, as opposed to, here is what I think, you must think this way too, because it's the right way to think. But driven by curiosity, I, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Christian evangelical worldview seems to quash curiosity more so than encourage it.
Yes.
So I'm really struck by how much you talk about curiosity and how, in another part of my life, I work on human-centered leadership development. And we always talk about coming to any relationship with curiosity so that you can create an open space, which will eventually become a safe enough psychological space for people to perform at their best and be more comfortable. What would you say to people who are curious themselves, but have people in their lives who are still in the evangelical community, and haven't really thought about, okay, well, maybe if I apply curiosity to this situation, I can get an outcome. Either I can actually learn something, or I can actually go farther than I might if I were, like, why the hell didn't you join us 10 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I really had to work through as someone who was coming out of fundamentalism is when I deconstructed my theology, I did not immediately or even know that I needed to deconstruct my fundamentalism.
Okay, tell me what
So
that means.
those are, those are different things. So I was deconstructing what I believed about God, and even to some extent what I believed about people and the world, but I still had a fundamentalist streak in myself. And so, I a couple years after I went through the deconstruction process, I'd go to church with my family at Christmas or whatever and be like, oh, I'm not gonna stand for this prayer. I'm not gonna sing this hymn. I don't believe this. But that was like clinging to a black and white, right or wrong. Well, I don't believe this to be literally true. And I really had to wrestle through my own fundamentalism. I think there's actually a fundamentalist streak throughout the progressive movement as well, whether you grew up in it or not. This, really like right or wrong, this is the way. And I do believe that there are facts. There are things that are true.
Right.
The things that are true, there are things that are not true, but there's actually a whole lot of stuff in the middle. And I think that it's not I'd really like invite folks to think about like what are the things that I feel really locked in about and get curious with yourself. And the more that you can do that, the more that you can do that with other people. But the other thing that's really interesting that's been happening in evangelical circles over the past few years is a war on empathy. And there
Right.
have been so many, books and think pieces and sermons, and so much time and energy has been spent over the past few years, really demonizing empathy.
Yeah, if you can
And
explain I that
yeah,
I
I mean,
don't get, and having
in order to have curiosity, you have to have empathy. And so I think that for folks who are still, not just in evangelical circles, but really trying to move a Christian nationalist or Christian supremacist agenda, um, you have to cut empathy off at the legs, or else the folks in your pews might actually get curious. They might actually feel something for the people who you're demonizing from the pulpit. And so I think it's really interesting that there's, that this war on empathy is strategic, because the more that you empathize with Renee Good, the more that you empathize with the immigrant kids who didn't show up in your classroom, the more that you empathize with trans youth who are being attacked at a school board meeting, the more you might get curious about it, and you might open the door to questions. And questions are bad in authoritarian worldviews. Questions are bad. And so, part of it is also, I think of ex-evangelicals as having, both this decoder ring that I think can be very helpful right now. And also I think about our superpower as being empathetic. And the more that we can lean in to empathy, but I think that the more that any progressive from any religious tradition or none at all, the more that we can kind of pair empathy and curiosity, and say to ourselves, like, I genuinely want to know what my mom thinks happened to those kids who didn't show back up to our classroom. That's also actively breaking my own fundamentalism at the same time.
wow, I hadn't necessarily put those together in quite the way that you have. So thank you for formulating it in that way. I'm very curious. You said there's a decoder ring. And when I
Mm-hmm.
talked to Andra, she talked about how there's a language of evangelical or fundamentalism, or, even across different types. Can you tell us more about some of that language um, and help us decode what some of the coded language is, but also like there's things in the evangelical community that you might say, Andrew particularly was talking about pornography, and what she said they meant was like art, like everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so those of us from outside might not understand the language that they're using. Can you help us with a little bit of that decoding?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's sort of like a simplistic version of that, which is what's just the like insider language that evangelicals use. That I remember back to my my college days, like there's a way that you pray that signals that you're part of a specific type of evangelical community. I hear it like when I hear when Christy Nome prayed at the Turning Point USA conference recently. I was like, "Yep, clocked it. You're doing all the right.
So
You're
tell me what
praying
those
the right
are.
way."
Tell me what those are.
Now, I'm not. I don't want to like self-traumatize.
Okay, so
But
whatever
there,
you're comfortable with, but
there's like a rhythm to it. There's a yeah, I'm even having a hard time like repeating it. There's a rhythm to it. There's like specific vocabulary and language. There's a way that you open it. There's a way you close it. That I totally used to do. And so when I hear someone doing it, I mean, I don't know what Christy Nome believes. There was probably a genuine part of her that like, this is how I pray. She's part of this evangelical world. She was also at a place where it was important for her to demonstrate that she knows how to use the insider, like she's an insider, right? So there's sort of that like simplistic version of it. The more complicated version is the kind of orientation of this world. So take, for instance, Project 2025. There's a lot that Project 2025 says on the surface that, as you indicated, there's a whole lot that's under the surface that's not said, but that's implied, and that proves that this is a fundamentalist authoritarian document.
mm-hmm.
This isn't literally in Project 2025, but the example that I always use is when I first heard that Trump was appointing Mike Huckabee to be U.S. ambassador to Israel. Sure, maybe that's a policy choice, but for me, it's an eschatology choice. Eschatology is the study of the end times. To me, that was, I'm taking a fundamentalist evangelical, I'm putting him in a place where he can control what happens with Israel as a state, because that is important to the trajectory for evangelicals for ushering in the second coming of Jesus. That is important to the ushering in of the rapture.
Right.
Right.
So just to be
That's
clear,
underneath the surface
right.
of what is very much like, no one was hiding that Mike Huckabee was the U.S. ambassador to Israel, but the reasoning for it is there's sort of a spiritual warfare kind of reasoning that kind of undergirds all of that stuff.
Well, this takes me in a slightly different direction than I was going to go, but I'm not sure that a lot of people really understand what the evangelical relationship with Israel is and why that's important. And I don't think that most people don't know that the biggest block of Zionists and money for Israel
Yes.
comes from the evangelical community.
Yes.
Can you help us understand why that it's important? I mean, you talked about eschatology, you talked about the rapture, but if you could just like make that connection so it's clear, because I think most people, I don't know, I mean, it depends on their their experience and whatever, and what they know and who they know and all that stuff. But I don't think people really realize what the connection is there.
Well, that's a whole college course.
Yes, they know.
But I'll say I guess the kind of short version of that is, evangelicals are obsessed with the rapture, with the second coming of Jesus, with the tribulation, with all of the things that you find in the book of Revelation, in the New Testament. And so one way, I think a very faulty way, but one way of reading parts of both the Old Testament and New Testament and the Christian Bible. One way of reading that is in order to usher in this beautiful future that explicitly rewards Christians and punishes everyone else. Right? To be clear, it's not a beautiful future for everyone, but in order to usher in this beautiful Christian for a specific type of Christian, Israel has to be restored restored in glory, restored to its fullness. No one actually knows what that means.
Okay.
There's no, the Bible doesn't say what that means. People are making up a bunch of things that they espouse, that they believe that it means. And one of those things is, for Israel as we know it today, rather than an ancient people that did not actually, was not a nation state, for Israel as it stands today to be a dominant force in the world. And so again, Mike Huckabees of the world are pursuing a very clear agenda that is trying to restore Israel, mostly just so that he benefits from it, so that he and people like him benefit from it.
So the key is if Israel is powerful, then when the end times come, the evangelicals get this glory. All the Jews are dead. All the Muslims are dead.
Yes.
And all of the non-evangelical Christians also. Right. Am I
tortured first and then dead? Yes.
Tortured first and then dead. Are the Jews and Muslims tortured too, or?
It depends on who you ask, but probably yes.
That's for most evangelicals. I didn't know about that piece.
That's the piece that they sneak in that they don't tell the folks who they're recruiting as Zionists, right? That's the thing that's so funny is that, evangelicals and white Christian nationalists are creating common cause with these groups whose cause they are actually not aligned with. They are looking out for themselves and kind of screw everybody else.
Right. So they might be really, really anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and still be very, very pro-Israel because it suits their goals. And
you can be anti-Semitic and Zionist very easily as a white evangelical.
Okay. So that is really good to call out.
And in fact, there are groups like Christians for a Free Palestine who are, I think, doing a great job of calling that out, of saying, let's be really clear about what the project of Zionism is, and that does not include Jews. Well,
Christians, originally Zionism was the longing to create a national home in Palestine for Jews.
Christian Zionism.
Very different things, as is right-wing Zionism. We could that's a
whole other college course
about, what is Zionism and what is post-Zionism, what is the anti-Zionism. But I think that's really very interesting given how Jews and anti-Semitism is being weaponized right now.
Absolutely.
It's very clearly there, but then they're saying, well, you must not be anti-Semitic because whatever, blah, blah, blah. We're going to use that to punish the people we don't like, but actually we're more dangerous.
Yes.
To Jews.
That's a great one sentence summary. of what's going on. Yeah.
Right. Um, so again, I didn't think we were coming here, but it's important. I mean, the world is interconnected. And I think there are much more nuanced conversations to be had than Israel should be everything so evangelicals can, get a good seat in the rapture, and Israel is fully and totally terrible, because there's you know, there's the difference between, somebody with an Israeli like Netanyahu with specific ideology and people who are Jews or just, you know, live in Israel or whatever. So that's just me kind of piping in for you. There can be multiple truths at one time where there's the evangelical side, but then the other side is you can want Israel to exist and also uh, believe that Israel is doing very bad things. And
Yeah.
that's multiple, or the Israeli government is doing very bad things, ways of thinking that have to be held together at the same time, I believe.
Yeah. And in fact, the lobbying groups around some of the kind of pro-Israel lobbying groups have been running campaigns where they are explicitly running pro-Israel digital ads, kind of geofencing them around Black churches, trying to pull Black Christians in to that project, to the Christian Zionist project. And I think the important thing to remember over and over again is that the evangelical fundamentalist authoritarian project will bring in whoever they need to use in order to move the project forward, and then discard those people.
Right. So
Right.
they're not really
Ultimately,
looking
that
for
project it's not looking for Black liberation, right?
right.
It's we need your bodies, or we need your votes, or we need your money, or we need this thing in order to move the project forward. We will very clearly lose you, right? As soon as we have what we need. It's a very
Not exactly. I mean, like discard as opposed to
yeah,
lose.
yeah.
Like not like you
Yes,
sort of
sorry.
like lose them all along the way, but like
Yes, no, very actively discard. Yeah, for sure.
so many things to be held in your mind at one time. I lost my train of thought. Okay, so somebody much earlier in the chat asked about the Seven Mountains Mandate. And I talked to Matthew Taylor last year, and he talked a lot about the New Apostolic Reformation, and we don't have to go into all of the details, but can you talk about who believes in the Seven Mountains Mandate, what it is, and what like that means for practical reasons? I mean, for practical life.
Yeah. I'm not going to do this justice in the way that Matt Taylor does.
I mean,
but the general idea
when I
behind the
talked to
seven
him, my mind like was
oh
blown apart in
yes,
several different pieces.
I mean, for those who, if you haven't read, if you haven't read his books, he also grew up evangelical. He is still Christian, but not evangelical.
You can go back and listen to my conversation with him. I'm not sure whether it's on video, but it's in freedomoverfascism.us, my Substack. And it is one of the most unbelievable yet highly believable, but mind-bendingly, explodingly important conversations I've ever had. So I recommend going back and listening to that. Okay.
Yeah. That's a great plug. His recent book, The Violent Take It by Force, is all about the New Apostolic Reformation and is a horrifyingly great read.
Mm-hmm.
It's really well written and horrifying. I mean, the basic idea behind the Seven Mountains Mandate is what lies underneath it is what's called dominionist theology, which just means that it's the belief that Christians, and you can sort of white, American, male, straight,
Listen, one of his books, White American Jesus.
Straight White American
Straight
Jesus.
White American Jesus. Okay.
Yeah, that's Brad Onishi, which is also a great, that's his podcast. And then he also wrote Preparing for War, which is a great read.
Okay.
So this dominionist theology is that, white Christians should rule, should have dominion over all parts of society. And while a lot of it focuses on America, they believe the same thing about the world. So it's not just America. Within the world, American Christians should have dominion, but within the U.S., white Christians should have dominion. And they've actually been, again, like super smart, super strategic about laying out what that means for them. So the 7 mountains represent various areas of society. So think things like education, entertainment, health, politics, law. It's sort of like big areas, sectors of society. And the goal is to get Christians at the top of the mountain in each of those areas. So as you see, Christian takeovers of media, Christian takeovers of education, Christian takeovers of health, that's not a coincidence. That is part of a blueprint. It's represented partially, like the short version of the story is Project 2025. The bigger version of the story is we're actually going gangbusters for all of it.
Mm-hmm.
So the vision of dominionist theology is we rule everything. And that gives us the power to then say what happens to everybody else.
Right. So it's all about power.
Everything is about power. Yes.
So this is a great conversation, because I think that as things become in what feels like binary situations,
Mm-hmm.
we have come to understand white Christian nationalists, one, as a monolith, but two, without the detail that helps understand it better, which probably makes it more problematic to just about everyone who is here. But understanding sort of the different, understanding that power underlies everything, and that the people who have taken power in the United States, the Pete Hegseths, who I believe is Seven Mountains guy, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. The Christy Noems, all the others who are Christian nationalists, who, sometimes the conversation is about empathy and lack thereof. Sometimes it's about hierarchy. But when you put it all together, it's about power for straight, white, Christian men.
Yes.
Because queer people are not included in there. Non-whites.
Neither are women.
None of them, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, neither are women, which I think is
Right.
important for white women to understand, is that white women are not included in this vision either. And if you listen to folks on the right, theologians, pastors, who are moving this agenda, like Doug Wilson and others, they will say very frankly and very openly, Doug Wilson said on CNN, no, I don't believe that women should have the right to vote. I think that was a huge mistake. The country went downhill when we extended the franchise to women. So it's important for white women especially to understand we are not part of this project. We will also be discarded, right? Like as you're soaking up power, and using different communities in order to climb your way to power, women will also be discarded as part of that. I think one of the distinctions I want to draw now that we've talked about empathy and curiosity and power is I think it's really important to draw the distinction between folks who are sitting in the pews of these churches and folks who are part of the structural power grab that is fueling an authoritarian regime. Those are different people. I can have empathy and curiosity for folks who are in the pews. I actually do not have empathy and curiosity for Pete Hegseth. And so I think it's really, I am not advocating that we um, sit down and have, heart-to-heart conversations with folks who are actively marching us toward authoritarianism. That's actually not the solution here. The solution to that is to be just as clear-eyed, not as ruthless, but as clear-eyed about power and authority as they are, and then be just as strategic. But I think it is important to have some empathy for the folks who are sitting in the pews who may or may not have actually thought about this, and create openness for them to actually divest themselves from that system.
That is a really important distinction. So thank you for drawing it, because there's nobody in this chat that wants to empathize with Pete Hegseth, and nor does he with us. So we're getting towards the top of the hour. And just to pull it together, I want to ask you one question and then give you the chance to tell people how to find you. The question I have is one that you sort of got to at the beginning. When you talk about how many ex-vangelicals there are, how many are like trying to stay away from politics, like don't, even though we all know that politics is every day and there's no separating, and how many are like actively engaged or can be actively engaged if they're reached in the right way.
Yeah. We don't know for sure around civic and political engagement. But we do have data. I've become a huge stan for the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, which has published some great data on ex-evangelicals. It's where I get a lot of my data. And what they've shown about, so they've asked questions and they've then sort of pulled out the kind of subsets of data on ex-evangelicals around two things, around ideology and around partisanship. And those two, so they basically ask, like, do you identify as conservative, moderate, or liberal? And do you identify as Democrat, independent, or Republican? And across both of those questions, the numbers aren't quite this like simplistic, but it's roughly a third, a third, a third on both of those questions. My hunch is that a lot of those independents or moderates are actually either non-committal, because when we committed ourselves to something previously, we were wrong. And so we are trying to stay away from committing to an ideology or committing to a party. So I think actually a lot of those folks are more aligned with the left, but maybe don't want to commit to it. Or folks who are actually further to the left than liberal or Democrat would indicate. And so they say, I'm independent. I would have a hard time right now identifying as a Democrat. I might answer that question independent. Not because I'm not on the left, but because I'm further to the left than Democrats. So I think that if you look
at Democrats is the same sort of relationship, the people who are in elected power versus
sure, yes,
like the people who are in the grassroots or who are activists are very different.
Totally right.
Groups of people. I talked about that with Anat last week, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So if you use that kind of math, if you make the assumption, and I think it's a pretty grounded assumption, if you make the assumption that then 2/3 of ex-evangelicals are probably more aligned with progressive values, and you look at, we have 15 million ex-evangelicals according to PRI, that's 10 million people who are probably aligned with the progressive movement, but either haven't been invited into it or may not have found a place in it yet. And that's why I think the project we're working on is really impactful and strategic, because it's a bridge. It's a way for folks who maybe don't feel welcome in those spaces or feel like they're going to look weird, or like, I was raised in a cult and I don't know how to talk about it. Like, it's a way for folks to kind of bridge that experience and find their way into the progressive movement. So what we're focused on right now is three things. is connecting ex-evangelicals and creating more community for folks who left a very deep community, trying to create ways for folks to find each other, both online and also especially in person. We're trying to visibilize ex-evangelicals by going on podcasts like this, but also by encouraging more people to tell their story, which kind of pierces this untouchable bubble of evangelical, the ways that evangelicals talk about their power. They actually don't, there are only twice as many white evangelicals as there are ex-evangelicals. So they've created a narrative that their power is inevitable, but I think we need to pierce that narrative. And then the third piece is organizing, is finding ways to use that decoder ring to figure out how do we actually intervene in this harm that white evangelical leaders are marching us toward, and using all of the what I might have thought of as useless knowledge from folks who used to sit in the pews of these folks to try to actually intervene in that agenda.
Wow. We're going over a little bit of time. I want to thank you for coming and talking about this. I think it was one of the most interesting conversations I've had in a really, really long time. I want to thank people in the chat. There's a couple people who are in other places than Substack, and ask you to tell people how they can reach you, how if they're in the ex-evangelical group, how they can help organize. So if you can tell people how to reach you, that would be great.
For sure. Go to the website, project2112.org. 2112 is actually a reference to Matthew 21:12. It's a story of Jesus getting angry that poor people were being taken advantage of in the temple and flipping over all the tables inside the temple. So it's not the year 2112, but it is a verse in Matthew. But project2112.org is where you can find out more about the project, is where you can find, sign up for the email list. If you are not ex-evangelical yourself, but folks who, former evangelical, post-evangelical, raised in the church, all of these are kind of signifiers for folks who might have grown up evangelical but left. Please feel free to, share the website with them. We are starting to do monthly community calls via Zoom. So really creating space, even if you don't have an in-person gathering organized, which we are working on. We want to make sure that folks are connecting together and kind of sharing their experiences together. So if you sign up on the email list, you'll get notifications about that.
That is so important. So thank you. And for those of you who are here or listening later, I invite you to get on Heather's mailing list and also to subscribe to Freedom Over Fascism, freedomoverfascism.us. If you can comment, share, and subscribe, that would be awesome. Free or paid. All my content is free, but I would really appreciate paid subscriptions. And stick around. There's more great conversations to come. And thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. You can find us online at www.freedomoverfascism.us. Please become a subscriber. And if you have the means, please support us with a paid subscription.